which we are doing, and so we'll begin. So again, I'd like to welcome everybody to this webinar today that CTAC, the Canadian Treatment Action Council, Canada's civil society organization focusing on access to treatment for people living with HIV and hepatitis C, is holding to address some really pressing policy-related concerns that are affecting market access for especially new hepatitis C treatments here in Canada. One of them being the queuing of new product submissions at the level of the Common Drug Review, the other being the Pan-Canadian Purchasing Alliance, a new bulk purchasing scheme that is being conducted interprovincially and interterritorially to collectively negotiate product listing agreements on new drugs. I'm going to go over these two areas in the webinar today, as well as talk about specific applicability of these pieces to market access for new hepatitis C treatments. My name is Paul Sutton. I'm a policy researcher here at CTAC, and I'll be leading us through the next hour or so of presentation, and then there'll be lots of time for questions at the end. Okay. So as I mentioned, today's agenda is basically going to go in three parts. I'm going to do a review of drugs to market in Canada, how does it work, and this is going to place particular emphasis on the Common Drug Review, which is a health technology assessment that's conducted by a large national civil society organization called the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technology in Health. That is a key component of the process by which public plans come to list new medications in Canada. And this is particularly important because we know due to the high prices associated with HIV and hepatitis C medication that the vast majority of people in Canada living with HIV and hepatitis C are going to be accessing their treatment through public drug plans. So we're going to talk about that. I'm then going to move into discussing the Pan-Canadian Pricing Alliance, or alternatively called Purchasing Alliance. It seems like the Council of the Federation, which is the collaboration of provincial and territorial premiers that have started this body. I haven't totally agreed on the name yet, but we will be talking about some of the moves that the Pricing Alliance has been undertaking, and some potential policy impacts, as well as how these might be affecting people who are living with HIV and hepatitis C. And then, well, I'll move into discussing some current issues in hepatitis C and why hepatitis C in particular stands to be negatively affected by these two recent policy moves. I just want to double check because there was a little bit of feedback, and it might have been my phone, but I just want to make sure that everybody has pressed *6 before we move into the webinar so that people aren't receiving some negative phone feedback. Okay. So the first section of this webinar today is called Drugs to Market in Canada, How Has It Worked? And I've put the word works in past tense deliberately because as we move into the second part of the webinar on the Pan-Canadian Purchasing Alliance, I'm going to explain that the scheme that we've been familiar with for the last 10 years by which drugs come to market in Canada is about to be radically changed, especially in the context of hepatitis C and HIV. But to start from the very basic, and this is going to be a review for a lot of people, but I want to make sure that we're all on the same page as we begin. This is an infographic that I pulled from the website for CADIS, the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technology in Health, that describes the four processes the four steps by which new medications become available on public drug plans in Canada. And so the first step is conducted by Health Canada, which asks, is a new medication safe? Does it work? I'm going to talk more about that in just a second. The second step is conducted by another federal regulatory agency called the Patented Medicines Prices Review Board that asks, is the price excessive compared to other developed countries? Then, and which I'm going to spend most of my time talking about in the first part of this webinar, the Common Drug Review, operated by CADIS, the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technology in Health, asks, how does the new treatment that we're looking at compare against existing treatment options in terms of its efficacy, but also in terms of how cost-effective it is, in comparison to a series of medical interventions that are already available. And then the final question, and this is the question, or the body that's going to be informing this question, is the one that's radically changing through the Pan-Canadian Purchasing Alliance. But federal, provincial, and territorial public drug plans ask, can we afford this new medication, this new intervention? So as I said, we're going to focus on the first three steps for the first part of this webinar, and then move into what's changing in the fourth step as we move toward the end of the webinar. But first, what does Health Canada do? So Health Canada has a responsibility when a new medication comes to market in Canada, or is attempting to come to market in Canada, to determine whether the new medication is safe, whether it's going to cause undue or dangerous adverse reactions in people who are going to be taking it, as well as is the medicine effective? And a way of also reframing that question is the medicine doing what it claims to be doing? Does it treat a particular condition, or the particular condition that it's claiming to treat? And in order to do this, Health Canada reviews the results from a series of clinical trials that are sponsored by the drug manufacturer who's bringing the drug to market. And these clinical trials are often called registrational trials. They occur in multiple phases, and Health Canada starts to review these trials at different periods in time, but generally as a medication is winding up phase 3 trials, which is showing its safety and efficacy in a larger population of somewhere between 1,000 and 3,000 patients, usually in general. So as I said, the questions that are being asked by Health Canada when it looks at this clinical trial data is the medication on balance safe to be used in human beings, and does the medication do what it says it's going to do? And if the answer is yes to both of these questions, then Health Canada issues what's called a Notice of Compliance, or an NOC. And this certificate, this Notice of Compliance, allows a manufacturer permission to sell or market a medication in Canada. So to bring it back to the hepatitis C side of the story, one of the confusions that a lot of people, I think, out in the community are experiencing right now is that people have heard that two new medications, Semaprevir, which is going under the trade name Glaxos and produced by Janssen, and Sofosbuvir, going under the trade name Sovaldi and produced by Gilead Sciences, has recently received notices of compliance from Health Canada, meaning they can be sold in Canada. And in fact, if one can pay out of pocket for these medications and has a doctor who's willing to prescribe them, I could walk over to Queen Street right now with a prescription and get access to that medication as long as I'm willing to pay for it. But as I mentioned earlier on in my introduction, the question for many people living with hepatitis C and HIV as well is, how am I going to get the cost of these drugs covered? And that's going to be through a public plan. So I think that one of the confusions that's shown up is, yes, these two new medications can be sold in Canada right now. That's definitely true. But the processes by which most people get access to these medications haven't checked off the box yet and allowed these medications to become available to the many people who need them. And that's going to be the major thrust of what we're talking about today. Okay. The second regulatory body that I want to talk about today is the Patent and Medicines Prices Review Board. And I don't have a ton to say about the Patented Medicines Prices Review Board, other than to mention that they are a body that does get engaged in the process of drugs coming to market in Canada. But I'm not going to spend much time on it because the purview of the Patent and Medicines Prices Review Board is actually, on balance with the other bodies that I'm going to talk about, a relatively limited intervention. The Patent Medicines Prices Review Board looks at a newly marketed or a new product that's been granted permission to be marketed in Canada or sold in Canada, looks at this medication and determines whether its price is excessive using the following criteria. And so the following criteria includes the price at which a medicine has been sold in another relevant market. So it's going to look at international comparators and the prices that are being the drug is being sold at in other jurisdictions to ensure that the Canadian price isn't unduly high. It's going to look at the price at which medicines in the same therapeutic class have been sold. So going to be looking at, for example, in the case of Semepravir, what's the price where current hepatitis C protease inhibitors are being sold, and how does Semepravir compare, for example. It's going to look at the pricing comparison, as I mentioned, to what's being sold in other countries, and it's also going to look at changes to the consumer price index. So interestingly, the Patent Medicines Prices Review Board has the authority to rule a price as excessive, requiring the manufacturer through regulatory enforcement to submit a reduced price. Importantly, though, to keep in mind, the Patent Medicines Prices Review Board very rarely does exercise the authority to rule prices as excessive, in part because for the most part, and again, I can really only speak to the HIV and hepatitis C treatment field as examples, but submitted prices tend not to be excessive in comparison to, or based on the criteria that I've shared above. That it generally is in line with international comparators and then doesn't get ruled as excessive. So the PMPRB is a process that every new medication goes through, but isn't one that's necessarily relevant to our case here. What is relevant, however, instead of just looking at price or cost as a marker in and of itself, what is relevant when we're talking about hepatitis C and HIV is the Common Drug Review. And that's the third step in this process. And as remember from the infographic a few slides ago, the question that's asked by the Common Drug Review is this medication cost effective in comparison to various efficacy levels of other available interventions? So where does it fit in the whole therapeutic area or class of the sort of arsenal or toolbox that we have to deal with a particular disease condition? And so the Common Drug Review is also, interestingly enough, a body that makes recommendations, and that these recommendations are based on the careful study of evidence that's available on new medications, and makes a series of recommendations to public drug plans, participating public drug plans, as to what they should do with this new medication, how they should list it, what kind of stipulations, limitations, or criteria should be put on a new medication in a cost-effectiveness framework. Another important thing, and I'm going to talk about this in some of the critiques of the Common Drug Review, is that the Common Drug Review looks at safety, efficacy, cost-effectiveness data, and also has a mechanism to engage the input of patient groups as well as now individual patients. However, what I've done here is I've really underlined cost-effectiveness more than these other criteria, and I've done that deliberately, in part because, and this is a critique of the Common Drug Review, the Common Drug Review kind of re-reviews the safety and efficacy data that's submitted to Health Canada. And one of the critiques that's leveled against the Common Drug Review is that parts of its processes are inherently duplicative, which is a position that CTAC holds, that the safety and efficacy reviews undertaken by the Common Drug Review are repetitive and can lead to substantial access delays for people who need drugs quickly, that the extra red tape of looking at the safety and efficacy data is something that could actually better be transferred from the Health Canada reviewers. And the reason why I've also not put patient input in under an underline as well is because it's important to point out that while the Common Drug Review does take patient input seriously, and over the last 4 years since it's implemented patient input processes into the Common Drug Review, that they really have strengthened the role of patient input, it's important to point out that patient input alone is never going to trump the question of cost effectiveness when the Common Drug Review is making a recommendation to public plans. If the cost effectiveness data is not there, patient input saying that a new drug is a really, really important intervention isn't going to hold water, is another way of putting it. And I just want to point that out there because at CTAC we often respond to calls for patient input in hepatitis C and HIV. And I think that it's also really important for patient organizations to recognize the limitations that patient input submissions have, and beyond that, to engage more fully with CADIS about ensuring that our patient input submissions, that we understand sort of what they are and what they do and what impact they have. Okay. As I mentioned, the Common Drug Review makes recommendations to public drug plans across Canada. And so the Common Drug Review has 18 member plans that it makes recommendations to, which includes all provinces and federal plans except for Quebec, which doesn't participate in the Common Drug Review and does this version of health technology assessment on its own. So the federal plans include the Canadian Forces Health Services, Correctional Services of Canada, the Interim Federal Health Program, or what remains of it, for those who are paying attention to some pieces that are happening in federal policy around the Interim Federal Health Program, non-insured health benefits for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, the Public Service Health Program, and the Special Access Program. And then another important thing to point out is that the Alberta and Northwest Territories drug plans are linked, and that for the most part there's a link between Nunavut and non-insured health benefits. Okay. This slide, which I'm sure is clear to everyone, is exactly how the Common Drug Review works. So I probably don't need to spend any more time on this, which is just a bad joke. I want to bring us into clear focus on this particular part of the Common Drug Review submission, how it works. So what happens when the Common Drug Review looks at a new medication is that they receive a large, complex dossier from the manufacturer who's making this new medication. And then the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technology and Health, CADIS, looks at this submission as well as retrieves more literature about new medications, as well as solicits patient input. And that all gets submitted into another dossier, which is commented on by the manufacturer. The manufacturer returns comments, and then all of this material is finalized and given to a body called the CDEC, the Canadian Drug Expert Committee, which is the body that, the expert body that reviews all of these materials and makes recommendations for that constitute the Common Drug Review listings. These recommendations are then submitted to the manufacturer. There's an embargo period, but then the recommendations are made public and are also sent to those drug plans that I just listed on the previous screen, all 18 of them. And those drug plans use this information. And in the cases of some of the drug plans, they then go and do some additional review, and that's something I can talk about in a little bit. But they go over the recommendations, and that's a rigorous and evidence-based process that the Common Drug Review makes. Looks over these recommendations and then makes decisions whether to list and under what conditions to list the new medication in question. Okay. The other thing, too, that I want to point out here is the division between a recommendation and sort of binding direction. And the Common Drug Review does a tremendous amount of work and weighs all the evidence, and it does its work in such a way that I'm confident that that it really is, that they really do their work in sort of conjunction and with really the best kind of standard practices for doing health technology assessment. Some people on the call may not agree. We can talk about that a little bit if we want to. But their recommendations are just that. They're recommendations. And there's another level that's undertaken by provincial drug plans where they may, for whatever reason, and reasons often are the inability to afford a particular drug at a particular time, but they may decide to either not list a medication that the Common Drug Review really believes in, or it might impose some listing conditions in order to mitigate what the cost of a new medication might be. Or the alternative is true, and was true in the HIV side of our work, in terms of the integrase inhibitor valtegravir, produced by Merck and marketed under the name Icentris, that the Common Drug Review gave a negative recommendation on Icentris, but many public plans decided to list it nonetheless because it proved to be a strong therapeutic option for many people living with HIV. The importance here is that the work that's done isn't binding. And also that the recommendations of the Common Drug Review can have some really negative impacts on access and have had negative impacts for people living with hepatitis C. So in the recent history of the most recent direct-acting antivirals, boceprevir and telaprevir. And what I want to point to here is that the Common Drug Review does and has continued to impose some strict treatment limitations that aren't necessarily in accordance with the latest science on when is best to treat hepatitis C by recommending to their drug plans, which most of the drug plans have decided to uptake because it's a way of mitigating costs, that people only get access to treatment if they have a fibrosis level of F2, F3, or F4, and oftentimes recommends that only one course of treatment is made available to people, even if people are not successful with therapy and do in fact need another course, and that it might be medically indicated that a new therapy or a new regimen might be useful. And so these are some things to keep in mind as we're talking about how these regulatory bodies do influence the conversation about clinical management of hepatitis C, and this particular piece is something that we all need to be working on. Okay. I want to really quickly, I mentioned valtegravir, which is the next slide, so I won't talk about it, but I do want to talk about instances in which there have been disagreements between the Common Drug Review and provincial plans. Again, this happens. This is from the HIV side of our work, and the example is tenofovir, which is an NRTI, a nucleoside reverse transcription inhibitor to treat HIV, produced by Gilead Sciences. And when tenofovir initially in 2004 went in front of the Common Drug Review, the Common Drug Review recommended to not list this medication because looking at the prices of medications in the same class, it noted that there was a 30% higher cost for tenofovir over other NRTIs, looking at lamivudine or 3-TC as the closest comparator at that particular point in time. So that was not good news, and it was widely protested by the HIV community. And for anybody who is familiar with HIV, one of the things that you'll also know is that tenofovir is, in the form that it currently takes now, co-administered with FTC or emtricitabine as Truvada, that it is widely prescribed now. So what happened there? Well, one of the things that happened was in 2006, the Common Drug Review changed its recommendation to recommend the use of tenofovir, or recommend clinicians to prescribe tenofovir to people who had experienced treatment failure or adverse events on drugs in the same class. So it did wind it up 2 years later. And then also one thing that people may not be aware of is that tenofovir is also indicated to treat hepatitis B infection. And so in 2008, the Common Drug Review looked at the data around hepatitis B and changed its recommendation for tenofovir. Importantly, at that particular point in time, many plans did ignore this recommendation, and this dramatizes this idea that the Common Drug Review makes recommendations, but they're not necessarily binding. And I've mentioned this to really kind of draw us into what some of the conundrums that we're facing today. So I want to talk finally about provincial plans and what they do now. And as I've made clear over the last several minutes, provincial plans do make their own decisions on what medications to list. And provincial plans, upon receiving feedback back from the Common Drug Review, are then tasked with negotiating product listing agreements with individual manufacturers. And as I mentioned before, these product listing agreements on the hepatitis C side of things have included prescription conditions that, again, are not reflected by the most recent science on when to initiate hepatitis C therapy, including high baseline METAVIR fibrosis scores, and as well as these product listing agreements negotiate the price by which the medication is going to be listed. Also importantly, the provinces of Ontario and British Columbia have their own review processes above and beyond the common drug review to again engage in another level of health technology assessment prior to negotiating product listing agreements. And so one of the things I really want to drive home is that where the common drug review is guilty of duplicating a lot of the work that Health Canada does in terms of reviewing safety and efficacy data, so do provincial formularies, or provincial drug plans rather, that then engage in another area of duplication by repeating what's actually conducted at the common drug review. And that's leading us, I think, into a pretty dangerous territory where a lot of us who are working in hepatitis C are reflecting on the fact and identifying the fact that new treatments are needed yesterday, they are needed quickly, and one of the things that the people that we work with cannot afford right now is any kind of a delay whatsoever, especially an undue delay, in new treatments becoming available. One of the other things that I also want to talk about, and it's especially relevant in hepatitis C because the BC model is currently under exploration to be applied as well through the BC Centre for Excellence in HIV and AIDS, is that in BC and Alberta, people living with HIV receive their care through hospital-based programs. And so HIV care is a little bit different than what we see through common drug review and listing onto public plans in BC and Alberta because people living with HIV receive medications through hospital pharmacies. Upon reviewing data that's been recently published by the BC Centre for Excellence that's trying to identify treatment uptake amongst people in various provinces across Canada, we can see actually that there's really strong reasons to consider prescribing medications through hospital pharmacies. In the red squares or the red circles that you'll see at the bottom of this particular slide, you notice that there's a vastly disproportionate coverage of people living with HIV receiving highly active antiretroviral therapies in British Columbia, Ontario, and Quebec, where we see a 10 to 13% differential, with 45% of people in BC receiving HIV medication right now. British Columbia is living with HIV receiving medication right now, and with this number largely attributable to the fact that HIV care is delivered through hospital pharmacies. And this is an important model that I think we need to think through as we ask a lot of questions about how best to deliver hepatitis C care. Okay. I want to get through this part of the presentation so that we can move on to talking about the PCPA, the Pan-Canadian Purchasing Alliance. And I want to sum up what we've been talking about now with some critiques for each of the regulatory bodies that I've addressed so far. Some critiques of Health Canada is that Health Canada only receives manufacturer-produced registrational trial data about new medications. And this is largely I would say, a sort of a factor of some of the difficulties and some of the investments that are required in bringing and studying new drugs before they come to market, and that manufacturers fund clinical trials on their medications, and that we don't live in the kind of research environment where there's a lot of excess funds available for investigator-driven trials on new medications. And so one of the things that Health Canada really only can do is look at the manufacturer-produced registrational trial data, because that's often all that's available. And yet it is a limited set of data to look at. Another critique of Health Canada, one that probably carries a lot more weight, is that Health Canada has been very lax on mandating phase 4 or post-marketing trials of new medications. And so one of the ways of describing this is that the clinical trial process and Health Canada assessment process is extra rigorous right up until the point that a new medication is available on the market, and then all caution goes to the wind, and Health Canada's procedures of assessing and regulating are really on the pre-marketing end of things and very little on the post-marketing end of things. And CTAC has long held a position that Health Canada needs to develop a stronger progressive licensing and post-marketing system to monitor new medications in Canada after they receive the market, or after they hit the market, especially to address adverse events. And that this and that language about this, and this is an issue, really has hit the newswire a bit more recently with new private member legislation introduced by the Conservative government in December, Vanessa's law, making some improvements around the reporting of adverse events for new medications. One of the major critiques that I really did address when talking about the Patent Medicines Prices Review Board is that it really has a limited framework for reducing drug pricing and very little kind of enforcement capacity in this way based on the questions that it does ask. And then one of the things that I really want to address is the federal, provincial, and territorial payers who, especially in the cases of Ontario and British Columbia, have duplicative processes, as well as payers tend to have a relative lack of a systematic framework for addressing drugs, other than the primary question, can we afford it right now? And that's not to say that that's not a valuable or a pressing question, but one of the things that I tend to think is that I'd like to see there be a stronger evidence-based assessment framework around medications other than can we just afford it? Where does other experiences, especially the needs of patients, fit in there? But CTAC's largest critiques are reserved for the Common Drug Review. And as I mentioned, we have concerns that the Common Drug Review remains 10 years into its function inherently duplicative of the Health Canada's role in reviewing safety and efficacy data, and that CDR's assessments do look at treatment in a broader therapeutic context, but do duplicate many of the assessments that it's undertaking. And that the CDR, it makes only recommendations. There's no enforcement, not even a timeline enforcement piece around the CDR recommendations being picked up by federal, provincial, and territorial payers. That there's a lax bridge between what the CDR does and how this actually gets taken up in real-life context of getting new medications to patients. And there's a tremendous amount of concern. It is important to point out, though, that in terms of price, the CDR has refused to list based on price where the PMPRB did not or was not able to in the context of tenofovir and moltegravir. And it's also important to point out that the claims that are made about the Common Drug Review and that the real hopes for it in 2003 was that it would speed up listing decisions for most jurisdictions, especially more resource-poor jurisdictions, that nevertheless Quebec, which doesn't participate in the Common Drug Review, on average still does list medications between 2 times and 4 times quicker than other jurisdictions. And so the CDR has not become as efficient as it's needed to be to ensure timely patient access for people living with HIV and hepatitis C and patients in general. And then one of the things that I also want to talk about is that the CDR is not actually equipped to address issues of equity in terms of health technology assessment. And I use the screen cap again of one of the recommendations that the CDR made. I think this one is for the direct-acting antiviral telaprevir, which is limiting treatment or which is recommending to limit treatment to people who already have substantial liver damage, to people who have for people to only have one course of treatment. And I want us to generally think about, this may be evidence-based in some kind of way of defining evidence-based, but is it equitable, right? Does this reflect all of the sets of needs that might be going into why a person might be interested in accessing hepatitis C treatment? I think if we think about that, there are a series of concerns to be brought up. And it seems like my graphics did not upload, which is too bad. This was supposed to be a slide that shows areas at which CTAC intervenes through this process. And this was also to be a graphic that shows where the PCPA is going to be entering into this framework, which is this new body, the Pan-Canadian Purchasing Alliance, which I'm about to discuss in another second, is coming in between the Common Drug Review and the decisions to list new medications on provincial and territorial plans. And that what we're seeing is a whole new step for that's increasing a period of time as well as opportunities for decision making when new medications come to market. So the next part of my presentation here is called the Pan-Canadian Purchasing Alliance, what we know, potential policy impacts, and treatment access for people living with HIV and hepatitis C. So the Pan-Canadian Purchasing Alliance, the PCPA, what is it? And I'm imagining that everybody on the webinar today has heard to one extent or another about the PCPA, but from what the experience that I'm having in talking to people throughout the country is that there's a lot of confusion as to what the PCPA is, what it does, and how it's going to work. And I think one of the things that's important to point out is that there probably should be a lot of confusion about what the PCPA is and how it's going to work, because it still very much is a body under development that has not standardized many of its processes, and also has not developed very many transparency mechanisms. And so we, as people who are working in civil society organizations or members of the public, we cannot actually look at and say what are standardized processes that the PCPA is using to operate, and how can we then account for them. Okay. So the Pan-Canadian Purchasing Alliance is an initiative of the Council of the Federation's Healthcare Innovation Working Group. And for those of you who unlike me, are not students of Canadian politics in every spare hour of the day, the Council of the Federation is the body of provincial and territorial premiers, which meets semi-annually, and has in recent years undertaken some additional collaborative activities with a specific focus on the healthcare sector. So the Council of the Federation has a Healthcare Innovation Working Group, and it's currently chaired by Premiers Redford of Alberta, Kathleen Wynne of Ontario, and Kozlowski of the Yukon Territory. The Care Innovation Working Group is looking at a number of initiatives, including reviewing the ways in which health systems are managed, looking for more efficiencies, of exploring good practices in terms of team-based approaches to healthcare, which is actually really good news for people living with hepatitis C and with HIV amongst many patients across the country, that there is a really strong focus amongst this group at looking at innovating our health system, and with many of those innovations being done in good ways. But one part of the mandate of this group, and one that has become of increasing concern to patient groups as well as to pharmaceutical manufacturers, is the Pan-Canadian Purchasing Alliance, a scheme for the bulk purchasing of brand name and generic pharmaceutical medications in an attempt to achieve broad-level health system price reductions. And so I'm going to go and talk a little bit more about what this is, how it's going to work, and maybe what some of the effects we can expect are. But it's also important to point out at this point, the PCPA is being participated in by all provinces and territories, and this is actually not correct. I should have updated this before I began. All provinces and territories with the exception of Quebec, Nunavut, and the Northwest Territories, and the federal health plans. Okay. This is a slide just to demonstrate that the cost of pharmaceutical goods in Canada on a per capita basis is a major public policy concern. And so I'm not attempting to come on this webinar today to talk about the Pan-Canadian Purchasing Alliance and to pretend that it's coming from a need out of nowhere. Canada does have the second highest per capita expenditures on pharmaceutical goods amongst the OECD, second only to the United States. And this is a major public policy concern, as we see also at the same time upward pressures that are happening on the health system and major year-over-year expansions in broad healthcare expenditures that we can only expect to increase even further as our Canadian population does age and requires the intervention requires increasing health interventions. It's an important thing to point out. We don't want to pretend as though this isn't a real policy reality, and we also don't want to pretend as though a bulk purchasing scheme might not actually, if it's done in a good way, have a substantially positive impact on Canadian health policy. For example, our sister organization, the Treatment Action Group in New York, does advocate the bulk purchasing in terms of generic medications in order to be able to increase HIV treatment access at home within the United States. And so it is, I think, an important public policy intervention to think seriously, but also to think critically about. And one of the things that I want to talk about today and raise some awareness about is ways in which the Pan-Canadian Purchasing Alliance is currently constituted may be very threatening in the Canadian access context, especially for people living with hepatitis C and HIV. I also want to talk about the sort of preconditions for the Pan-Canadian Purchasing Alliance. So what I've clipped here, this is a screen cap from a position paper that CTAC's developing, or that CTAC's actually updating right now. It's our position paper on generic medications, and it was published in 2007. And as you'll be able to see here, this is the section that's on the potential uses of bulk purchasing, and I just want to read it out here so that we can maybe just get an idea of how far we've come in a really short period of time actually on this question of bulk purchasing. So it's doing a bit of a pros and cons analysis. The pros here are that bulk buying is one of the main pillars of the proposed national pharmaceutical strategy. Not that that's something that we're hearing very much about anymore, but the proposed national pharmaceutical strategy and the concepts currently being examined at that point by the federal government. The concept, therefore, is clearly considered a viable option from the government's perspective. The cons, though, are the provinces do not, for the most part, cooperate on the delivery of health services. Their choices and decisions are made independently from each other. This model would require considerable interprovincial cooperation. Furthermore, the model suggests a national formulary for which much opposition exists. And I really want to point this out as there's been a significant move from 2007 until right now in terms of the lengths to which the provinces and territories are interested in participating with each other and engaging with each other in collaborative opportunities to bring down the price of both generic and this is probably the real major growth, and brand name medications. We're not at a national formulary. That's not something that's being discussed by this particular group, and it doesn't seem like it's going to be on the realm of discussion by this particular group, but they are talking about the collective power to purchase new medications in order to bring pharmaceutical-related health expenses down. Okay. The Pan-Canadian Purchasing Alliance has decided to undertake some interventions both on generic and brand name pricing, and this really isn't the role of the primary hepatitis C focus of what we're talking about today, but I do want to mention briefly that the Pan-Canadian Purchasing Alliance since 2010 has entered into product listing agreements on 5 widely used generic medications. We don't know which ones they are, and that's something that I'm going to talk about a little bit more in terms of one of the problems that we anticipate with the PCPA. But we do know from an annual report released on the Health Innovation Working Group's activities in the middle of 2013 that there is an expected $100 million of annual savings across the country to drug plans once these new generic prices take effect on April 1st, 2013, which has already taken place. What is also being attempted by the Pan-Canadian Purchasing Alliance, and it hasn't been successful yet at doing so, unless there has been a recent success that I haven't been made aware of since December, but they're also attempting to establish a new threshold of how much a generic version of a medication is worth in comparison to the brand name medication's price. And while in circa 2007, the average price, according to the analysis that was done in our position paper at that particular time, that the average cost savings was only 50% at that point in time when a generic was being used instead of a brand name manufacturer. So some, but not a significant savings. The new threshold is to have generics be 18% of the brand name price, which would reflect a tremendous amount of savings, and introduce a real focus on the use of generic medicines in a way that we don't see consistently across Canada, across provincial and territorial formularies. Some provinces do use more generics than others. Manitoba is a key example, but the uptake of generic medications really is relatively low, considering the size and usage of our public drug plans by 7.8 million Canadians. Okay, what I want to talk about is brand name pricing, and again, I also do apologize that I wasn't able to update this slide before the presentation. This has the pre-December 2013 data. It's been determined now that all new brand name medications granted a notice of compliance will be considered by the Pan-Canadian Purchasing Alliance before they're negotiated by individual member drug plans. The member drug plans who are participating in the PCPA really have identified that they're probably going to get their very best price if they collectively bargain with the rest of the provinces and the Yukon Territory, which is participating. And so the PCPA really has raised into high gear. So this is actually data from the 2012 annual report released in 2013, noting that at that point, 8 joint negotiations had been completed and 17 products were under active negotiation. In fact, now 26 negotiations have been completed, so that's another 18 over the last year, and of course there are more to come. And so one of the things that I think that we need to keep in mind is that on the Pan-Canadian Purchasing Alliance, very much the train has left the station, and while a lot of it's certainly under development in terms of its procedures and making those procedures transparent and public, it does appear that the Pan-Canadian Purchasing Alliance is here to stay, and one of the things that we need to do, especially as civil society organizations, is figure out where and how we're going to be able to meaningfully intervene and engage and inform the process by which these bulk purchasing negotiations are being undertaken. Okay. Briefly, I want to talk about the general process that the Pan-Canadian Purchasing Alliance is using in order to move forward. So you'll see at the top, the box there is a final recommendation from the Canadian Drug Expert Committee about a new medication. It's then forwarded along to the Pan-Canadian Purchasing Alliance, where it's determined that either the new medication is going to go through Pan-Canadian purchasing negotiations, or if it's going to be dealt with at the provincial territorial level. And as I mentioned, since this chart was made, it's been determined that all new brand name medications will go through Pan-Canadian negotiations. So the box that you see at the right isn't something that even exists in this model anymore. And the Pan-Canadian Drug Pricing Alliance can also then decide if there will be no negotiations and if it's not going to move forward either collectively or individually. However, in the case, and as we can expect will mostly be the case in any new brand name medication that has a list or a list with criteria condition recommendation from the Common Drug Review, that it will go to Pan-Canadian negotiations, that these Pan-Canadian negotiations are secretariated by the Government of Ontario, who then works to determine a lead negotiating jurisdiction. So one provincial drug plan manager from various provinces or territories, everybody takes their turn. And then provincial and territorial drug plans decide if they're going to opt into the negotiations. And then from there, the Government of Ontario in its secretariat role informs the manufacturer of the decision to take a pan-Canadian approach. Okay. The other thing I wanted to say here, I slipped my mind, so it will come back to me. One of the things that I want to point out, this is a bit more of a recent model of how the PCPA does its work, that is to show that there's no standardization in terms of the most important timelines for the PCPA's activities, which for me in my analysis is around negotiation. So upon initiation of the PCPA process, a recommendation is issued by the Common Drug Review. We're told here on this particular slide that in greater than or less than or equal to 2 weeks, it'll be tabled at an organizational teleconference by the Secretariat. That equal to or less than 2 weeks later, participation will be confirmed and a lead provincial negotiator will be assigned, and that less than or equal to 2 weeks later, a letter is going to be sent to the manufacturer informing them of their decision. Now, 6 weeks may not seem like a lot of time to people, but we're looking at 6 weeks plus up to several months and maybe even a year being added to an already time-consuming process that isn't either the conclusion of this process isn't the be-all and end-all of the process. That these negotiations are going to take place, and then provinces and all the participating provinces in the Yukon Territory then have to decide, okay, the deal that's been made through this pan-Canadian process, are we going to say yes or no? So it's creating additional delays. However, I think the largest area of concern regarding the Pan-Canadian Purchasing Alliance and how it will bear on treatment access is that the way that it's currently constituted, all jurisdictions, so all participating provinces in the Yukon Territory can choose to opt into this collective negotiation. But once the negotiations have been completed, provinces and territories then have the option to opt out. And so one of the things that we know from recent monitoring of what the PCPA has been doing is that all provinces and the Yukon Territory tend to be in on new negotiations. This is, and I think for obvious reasons, that it is incredibly likely that payers will get the best deal that they can if the potential promise is held out to manufacturers that if the price is slightly better, you'll get access to the market in every region. That this is a pretty attractive carrot on stick for provinces and potentially for manufacturers. However, as may not be particularly surprising, the scheme set up in such a way where it is much friendlier to provincial drug plans and provincial drug plan managers than it is to manufacturers, as well certainly to patients and patient groups. And the thing to be particularly concerned about is that all provinces can opt in and are generally opting into the negotiations, but that there is a profound consequence if they do, at the end of the negotiation, decide to opt out and not list the new medication based on the general agreement or LOI, letter of intent, that's been determined through the collective bargaining process. And if they do decide to opt out, there's a 2-year moratorium put in place on the federal, provincial, or territorial drug plan to engage in new negotiations to list a medication onto its drug plan. Right? And one of the things that we do know is that the decision to opt out is much more likely to be made by drug plans from poor-resourced provinces. And so one of the things that we know about the Common Drug Review was that one of the big reasons it was put into place was to provide support in terms of making health technology assessment decisions to smaller provinces and less well-resourced drug plans like in the Atlantic provinces. And I think one of the things that we're going to see as the PCPA moves forward is that there are going to be collective agreements made that are going to come up with drug plan or with otherwise pretty good prices for medications, and that some provinces are not going to be able to even afford that pretty great deal, and that there's going to be an opt-out which is going to mean that people, especially people living with hepatitis C and HIV, who need new therapies now, are going to have to wait for 2 years because of the standards that have been in the agreement that's been made by the Pan-Canadian Purchasing Alliance, and that this also is a scheme that's particularly unfriendly to manufacturers because manufacturers will get to a place of negotiation where they think that they provided a price that's going to be picked up by maybe all the jurisdictions who are participating, and suddenly are not going to get to be able to list their medications in some areas, which again, as I said, is good for the people who are managing public plans, and not good for industry, and very, very, very bad for patients. Okay. So what I want to do now to conclude this webinar and then open up into the discussion period is to move into a discussion of how these issues may map into hepatitis C. And what I first want to talk about is the other primary area that was advertised for this webinar, which is the decision to queue new common drug review submissions. So I want to bring us back to about 20 minutes ago when we were talking about some of the major critiques of the common drug review, specifically that it's duplicative. One of the things that's happened now at this particular time is that the common drug review has been put into a situation in which it's made the decision to queue, to basically make a lineup of new manufacturer or new product submissions that needs to be looked at by the Canadian Drug Expert Committee. It's important to keep in mind that the Common Drug Review, as operated by the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technology and Health, does have a set of finite resources. It's paid for by its member plans who send a finite amount of funds to Ottawa every year to run the Common Drug Review. One of the things that's happened, and this is really linked, I think, to the Pan-Canadian Purchasing Alliance, is that over the last year, a large number of manufacturers, not just in hepatitis C and HIV, but across disease areas, have submitted what's called pre-NOC, so pre-Notice of Compliance submissions to the Common Drug Review in an attempt to, and I think in a good way, in an attempt to speed up the process, recognizing that the Pan-Canadian Purchasing Alliance, even at its very best, even when working really efficiently, is going to create additional delays. And this was an option that was available to many manufacturers to attempt to get the Common Drug Review part of the assessment process sped up. However, it backfired on everybody. It backfired on manufacturers. It certainly backfired on the Common Drug Review, and there are really substantial problems that are now facing patients as a result. The Common Drug Review got too many new products submitted to review, and the Canadian Drug Expert Committee had to decide to cap the number of reviews it can make to 2 per monthly meeting due to the excessive demand and to finite resources. And so one of the things that we're seeing, and which is also in itself a reasonable decision, we can't expect that the Canadian Drug Expert Committee is going to be able to meticulously and rigorously review the files of new medications, especially when it's duplicating safety and efficacy data already determined by Health Canada, but that's another story altogether, that it's going to be able to do 10 new submissions a meeting. So the limit of 2 has been put into place due to excessive demand and finite resources, and the Common Drug Review has made a policy decision to move through these queued product submissions on a first-come, first-served versus a needs-based basis. So if you got in first, your new medication is going to be looked at. So one of the things that we're seeing is that life-saving medications such as Semiprovir and Sofosbuvir, the 2 medications currently before the Common Drug Review to treat hepatitis C, are being assessed after, in the case of Semiprovir, Semiprovir will have to wait for the cosmetic drug Botox to receive a new indication by the Canadian Drug Expert Committee before this life-saving hepatitis C treatment will be reviewed and have a recommendation made. And so one of the things that we can see is that while each of these 3 points that I've made here, the idea that manufacturers would really try their best to speed up the process and get the Common Drug Review to look at their files earlier, that the Canadian Drug Expert Committee would limit their workload to a reasonable amount of 2 files per meeting, and then the Common Drug Review would decide to go through each of these files on a first-come, first-served basis, may look like logical decisions to make each of their own, but it really shows that there's a domino effect working here, and guess who's experiencing the most negative consequences of this domino effect? Well, it's patients who need new medications quickly, especially people who are living with advanced hepatitis C and need new therapies right now. What I also want to talk about is another piece that CADIF is undertaking right now that many people I know on this webinar have heard about and participated in feedback opportunities for is therapeutic review, which is conducted by a whole other department at CADIF, which is trying to give some clarity about the ideal uses of new medications in hepatitis C, of trying to provide some clarity to this very busy pipeline that's coming forward, to have a reference document that will be useful to participating drug plans. These are the main questions that are being asked by CADIF in this therapeutic review, but really what they boil down to is how do these new medications compare for treating hepatitis C genotype 1 to what's currently available in terms of safety, efficacy, and cost effectiveness. And then also they're looking at addressing the question of at what METAVIR fibrosis score is treatment cost effective for patients, which is an important question that I talked about right at the very beginning of the webinar, as well as what's the comparative clinical efficacy for people who have previously had an inadequate response to prior therapy, specifically addressing the question of if somebody has previously failed therapy on a pegylated interferon containing regimen, does it make sense to provide people with a pegylated interferon comparing or included therapy now, or should people be waiting until there are interferon-sparing regimens, which we expect to be medically available at the very least in early to midway through 2015? Okay. I want to talk a little bit about issues in terms of this therapeutic review. One is that, and I think that there's a question that we should have in terms of how it will be used. And so this therapeutic review, it's been told to us, is going to be used by the Canadian Drug Expert Committee and potentially by federal, provincial, and territorial plan managers to help make better informed decisions to move their way through assessing a very busy hepatitis C pipeline. We also received confirmation in terms of the development or the input, the stakeholder input process around this therapeutic review, that drugs currently queued are not going to be delayed until the therapeutic review is complete. So the therapeutic review is going to exist kind of alongside in a whole separate house from the Common Drug Review's work. But I think that there are also some important context issues to address as well. One of the things that this, and just to move back here, is the therapeutic review has been set up in such a way that it's comparing new direct-acting antivirals, semaprevir, sofosbuvir, and feldaprovir, as though that would be comparing apples to apples. And one thing that we want to address is that in a busy pipeline, we're also moving into a much more complex treatment pipeline for people living with hepatitis C, and that semaprevir and feldaprovir are protease inhibitors, sofosbuvir is a polymerase inhibitor, and so this isn't an apples-to-apples comparison, which brings up the question of, is this a wise thing to do right now in the context of a busy pipeline if the context for treatment, which is adding on another medication to ribavirin and pegylated interferon, is only going to be applicable for one more year. And so these are some, I think, some questions to be really aware of when we're talking about hepatitis C right now. That was supposed to be a chart, which is not. So I want to talk maybe into bringing us to more of a close, is that the question is it a wise use of resources at this particular point in time for CADIS to be devoting a lot of energy to doing a therapeutic review when what you're seeing on the screen right now is what hepatitis C treatment, at the very least in terms of medical availability, should look like in the coming years, and by mid-2015, really at the very latest, with a really strong potential offering, a combination sofosbuvir lidiposphere treatment produced by Gilead Sciences, which is showing 95 to 100% SVR rates after 8 to 12 weeks of therapy in phase 3 clinical trials, as well as another combinations being produced by AbbVie, a 5-drug combination that's being studied in phase 3 at 12-week therapy, showing 95% clearance rates in people with genotype 1A and 98% clearance rates in genotype 1B, with a couple of leading phase 3 and phase 2, or rather trailing phase 3 and phase 2 trials by Bristol Myers Squibb and Merck. The question is, how are we using our resources at this particular time at the level of the health technology assessor through CADIS, when really what we need are actually strong recommendations to be made on the uses of the drugs that are relevant to formulary listings right now. So I want to end with a little bit of a discussion around what's needed for us to have a pathway to a hepatitis C cure. And one of the things that we've developed and we've been sharing around a little bit is a roadmap that CTAC's developed to inform the work that we do in speaking about what viable treatment options might look like, to describe what really our partners and stakeholders that we've been talking about this with, as well as we have through monitoring the pipeline, have identified as the real needs, the comprehensive needs for hepatitis C cure. That we need pan-genotypic and pan-co-infection indicated therapies with varying combinations, probably not just one perfectivir to be able to treat all genotypes and all co-infections, that we need a dedicated federal transfer for hepatitis C treatment, which could be most easily achieved by continuing the federal hepatitis C undertaking agreements once they expire in 2015 to encourage more provincial uptake of dedicated treatment options and treatment funds for people living with Hep C. If we're serious about curing Hep C, we'll need eligibility for people with METAVIR fibrosis scores level 1 or 0 in environments where there's high hepatitis C prevalence in order to bring the prevalence levels down. We need increased testing and evidence-based testing campaigns. We need multidisciplinary care, especially for people who are going to be undertaking treatment who use drugs and or have dual diagnosis, especially mental health diagnoses. And this will be even true once treatment's quite easy to take in its interferon-sparing combinations, as well as we need universal harm reduction programs in order to make sure that a ramping up of hepatitis C treatment doesn't correspond with massive prevention failures. So the take-away messages that I want people to step away from this webinar today is that there are major regulatory hurdles that are bound to inhibit a comprehensive cure and the availability of that cure for hepatitis C. The major ones are that the Canadian health system is currently not equipped to fund treatment rollout on this scale, especially for a high-needs population. And if you think about it, since the implementation of Canadian public health care in the 1960s, we have not been asked on a broad societal level to cure a disease. We just haven't, right? We know how to treat things, we know how to put people into care, we know how to keep people in care, but we don't necessarily know how to make the massive wide-scale investments to really deliver a cure. And that's one of the things that our health system is going to have to take a look at. We know that pricing and market access structures are not equipped to assess a busy pipeline and that they require reform. We recognize that where clarity is needed in current procedural standards, that delays are likely to follow. and that changing regulatory structures and ongoing austerity measures are going to threaten access. The second page of this is that we can be aware that the Patent Medicines Prices Review Board is unlikely to lower prices, although there's uncertainty as to how these new medications will be assessed at the Common Drug Review. And also there was just a news story today about how United States private plans are balking at the high costs in that country of semaglutide and sofosbuvir, and that's something to pay attention to, and how that might play here in Canada. CDR queuing means the following review schedule, an incredibly frustrating review schedule of semaglutide not being seen by the Common Drug Review until May 2014 at this point, so several months away, and sofosbuvir and the HIV integrase inhibitor dolutegravir not being seen by the Common Drug Review until at least October or November of this year, when these drugs could have been available a lot sooner. We know that the timelines for the Pan-Canadian Purchasing Alliance review process are uncertain and will create additional delays, probably moving us into 2015. And we know that there are long-term results and implications for the Pan-Canadian Purchasing Alliance in general. The big question is, will all therapies actually be introduced into the Canadian market, and what will that mean to patients? And this is also to say that, as I mentioned earlier in the webinar, that the Pan-Canadian Purchasing Alliance is a train that has already left the station. And so one of the things that we all need to be aware of is of all opportunities that are available to provide additional input, that there will be more additional input opportunities this year of how to refine the processes for the PCPA. So that's my presentation, our webinar for today on the CDR, the PCPA, and some current issues in hepatitis C. And so I'd like to thank everybody for participating. And now is also a great time for people to ask questions if they wish, and I'm happy to respond to them. If you want to ask a question, what I'm going to ask you to do is to recall that function that I showed very early on in the presentation, the raise hand function, and just click the raise hand feature, and then I'll call people in the order that they appear. So thank you. And if you have questions, feel free to ask them now. Okay, I have a question from Alan M. And what I'd like you to do, Alan, is to press #6 to unmute your line, and then we'll be able to hear your question.
Yes, hi, Paul.
Hi.
Hi. Well, first, thank you very much for this presentation. I think it was a great webinar, very instructive. Great job. And my question is the following: regarding your comment about drugs like hepatitis C being life-saving and having to wait, being queued behind drugs like Botox, for example. I fully agree with your comment. Now my question is, have you taken a look at the current status of priority reviews requests to CDR? What is the status at this point when a drug submits for priority review?
Certainly, and we have looked at that, although not in this particular instance, because what we've been concerned about at this particular point is that the decision, whether priority review or not, has been made by the Common Drug Review to move forward with these particular files in a first-come, first-served basis. So it's certainly something I think to look at in the future. But as we move through addressing this particular need right now, one of the things that we're encouraging, that we're potentially considering encouraging the Common Drug Review to undertake is to come up with a metric, and we've suggested the highest anticipated increase in quality-adjusted life years as a measure to come up with an order that's a little bit more evidence-based than first come, first served in terms of moving through this particular set of queued submissions. But thank you for that. It's an important question and a thing for us to continue looking on for.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I have a question from Barbara. So you'll have to press #6, Barbara, to ask your question.
Hi, Paul.
Hi.
I just have a quick question, just a little bit of clarification, because I've seen both used. Is it the Pan-Canadian Purchasing Alliance or Pan-Canadian Pricing Alliance?
So if anybody on the call has a better clarification of what the name that we're actually using is, I would like to hear it. On the Health Innovation Working Group's publications, it's referred interchangeably as the Pan-Canadian Purchasing and the Pan-Canadian Pricing Alliance. I've been using purchasing in the development of most of the work that I've been doing on this file, because I feel that it's a little bit more descriptive, and I'm waiting for instruction from the PCPA itself to determine exactly what it's going to be known as on an ongoing basis. So your guess is as good as mine, and hopefully we'll have some answers about that in terms of consistency, but it would be, of course, also nice for the PCPA to deliver a transparent description of what its assessment processes are going to be before we get the clarification on the name. So thanks for that.
Thank you.
We have a question from Deb, and so Deb, you'll have to press *6 to ask your question.
Hi, Paul.
Hi, Deb.
Thank you for this. This is really great, and I really appreciated the last couple of slides talking about the kind of policy areas that we can be thinking about to influence in order to cure hepatitis C. And I think when you said hepatitis C in that context, you're thinking about like actually clearing the virus from the population.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so awesome. Thank you. So my question goes back to the very beginning, and I think it was in a slide about the CADIS process and that there is an embargo period. Can you explain what that is?
Okay, we're going to take a rapid fire through the slides so we can all look at what Deb's referring to here. Although it's a really simple explanation. I don't know exactly what the time period is associated with it, Deb, but there's a period of time in which the recommendations that have been made by the Common Drug Review aren't made public. And that's to give manufacturers an opportunity to review the decision by the Common Drug Review before it's made available to plans. Okay. It's not a long period. If I'm not mistaken, it's somewhere between 15 and 20 business days before the decision sent out to participating stakeholders and posted on the CADIS website. But it's just a short period of time to sort of allow space for the direct stakeholders, specifically the manufacturer, to get their hands on the next part of the process.
Okay, that's great. It's not like the moratorium that can be...
Absolutely not, no.
Kicked off, no. Okay.
That's yeah, so and I mean, importantly too, the language of moratorium isn't as far as I know what the PCPA is using to describe that process, but of course it is tantamount to a moratorium to say that provincial plans can't negotiate on their own for 2 years. So that's just a clarification there.
Thank you.
Yeah. Are there any other questions? I'll give a couple of minutes for people to place their hands up if you do. Okay, one question from Robert. Robert, you'll need to press #6 in order to ask your question.
Hi, Paul.
Hi, Robert.
Thank you so much for the session today. It's very informative and takes us back through how all of this complex working goes on at various levels. The question is, having worked very closely with patient organizations on a number of patient submissions for Common Drug Review, is there anything that patient groups are able to do when they have submitted their submissions back in October or earlier of this year for products that are not being reviewed until May or even October of next year? That means that you provided input almost 6 months to 1 year prior to review by Common Drug Review. Is there anything that we can do as advocates to move this forward, or is this something that we still need to really think about and challenge ourselves?
So thank you for this question. It does give an opportunity for me to provide a little bit of kind of follow-up information on some things that CTAC's been doing in conjunction with some support from a number of our partners, including a number of people who are who I've seen are participants in this webinar today. So thank you in advance for your support on the initiative that I'm about to describe. So upon realizing that that we're in a really sort of inexcusable situation in which there are going to be these massive delays, especially on hepatitis C treatments, to be seen by the Common Drug Review. Right at the beginning of January, CTAC, as the lead, authored a letter with 25 of our partners, including civil society organizations, national organizations, as well as local organizations from around the country, as well as a number of clinicians, and directed it toward the Common Drug Review, or to CADIF, to the CEO of CADIF, requesting a response on the proposal that I described earlier to the first question, to first off, to reinstate a Canadian Drug Expert Committee meeting, the April committee meeting, which they canceled without explanation, so pushing everything back one more month, to explain the fact that that none of these files had been moved forward on, which we as patient groups were under the impression that when the announcement of queuing came in midway through 2013, that CADIF staff would still be moving the files forward so that they could be seen by the Canadian Drug Expert Committee as quickly as possible. And then we also furthered our proposal at that particular point in time that the queue be addressed in highest increased quality order as opposed to first come, first served. And so we're still awaiting a response on that letter. Although the time limit that we set for that response is coming at the end of Friday, and so one of the things that we will be doing is engaging further with the partners who signed on to that letter once we've received a response about what the next step action will be. And hopefully there won't be a next step action, and CADIF will reverse its position and assess the medications in the order that we proposed. Although I'm not sure that that will happen quite as yet. I'm hopeful, of course. As to what the next steps CTAC's interested in providing leadership on, as well as receiving some feedback and other ideas from groups who are interested in working in coalition with us. Which is to say, for those of you who are hearing about this letter for the first time and would like to know more and would like to be interested in working in closer partnership with us, as we move through this difficult process and try and speed up the process by which semaprevir, sofosbuvir, and then other hepatitis C and HIV treatments are going to be assessed by the Common Drug Review, I certainly invite you to get a hold of me at my email address, paul@ctac.ca, or to contact our executive director, who's also working on this file directly, Brian Huskins, brian@ctac.ca. So it's a good question. Thanks, Robert, for it. I have another question from Deb. So Deb, just press #6 and ask your question whenever you're ready.
Hi, Paul. That was actually my question. What the next steps are? That's great.
Good.
Thank you.
Yes. Yeah. So it is important to say that and it's a nice way to kind of conclude here that we wanted to offer this webinar to provide a certain amount of clarification as to what's going on in these areas right now. Informing market access around treatments is obviously a complex area for any of us who are on the call who've been working on it for varying amounts of time. And so we want to make sure that we can bring everybody onto the same page, as well as really underscore the point that collective action by civil society organizations is going to be needed in this area in conjunction with other partners as well, in order to make sure that we can speed up access to hepatitis C treatments. As we're all aware, they're very, very needed. So what I'd like to do then is conclude the webinar today, and I'd like to conclude by inviting people to fill out an evaluation survey. And so you'll see that it's just popped up in the middle of the screen. So if you could click on the text in the middle of the screen and then on the Browse To button, that will take you to our evaluation. Again, I'd like to thank everybody so much for participating, and we look forward to seeing you participate in future CTAC webinars.